So I will be answering question 4, what makes educational and school psychologists leaders in evidence-based school intervention? So this question does seem obvious on the surface because of all the previous questions that we have answered, questions 1 through 3. We've learned that deciding upon interventions is a primary responsibility of school psychologists. McKevitt 2012 states that one of the primary roles and responsibilities of school psychologists practicing in the schools is to design effective interventions that ensure that these interventions are backed by sufficient research-based evidence to increase the chances of effective treatment for the student. Now, also the National Association of School Psychologists, NASP, states that their mission for supporting and representing school psychologists and the field of school psychology is accomplished through their identification of appropriate evidence-based education and mental health services for all children, implementation of professional practices that are empirically supported, data-driven, and culturally competent. The interventions that school psychologists are using are not chosen at random. School psychologists work with other stakeholders, such as teachers and parents, and use a foundation of assessment and data collection to create recommendations based on evidence. And we've seen this through our previous research that we used to answer the previous questions. In NASP Principles for Professional Ethics, Principle 2.3, Responsible Assessment and Intervention Practices, states that school psychologists must select assessment instruments and strategies that are reliable and valid, and it further states that school psychologists must use interventions, counseling and therapy procedures, consultation techniques that are all research-based. Interventions that are backed up by peer-reviewed literature and research should be given preference. So as you can see, all aspects of the school psychological services offered by school psychologists appear to be data-based and data-driven. However, McKevitt 2012 points out that a large amount of school psychologists' time, around 70%, this is what we already had found with the previous questions, is spent on assessment and consultation. He questions how much time is actually allocated to the review of the literature when choosing interventions. And I've also wondered this. So if we are spending all this time assessing students, and I've heard of many school psychologists speak of large caseloads and a time crunch that's always present. You have that certain time period that you have to have each case done. How much or how thoroughly is the literature being reviewed to make sure that those interventions are supported by evidence? Specifically, McKevitt 2012 in his study addresses social emotional learning interventions. This area is important because schools tend to focus on academics first and social emotional needs second, if at all. And in my response to question 3, I kind of touched on that point, the social emotional aspect of it, and we know that a lot of schools are falling behind on that. This is important because research has demonstrated that well-implemented, well-designed, and sustained social-emotional learning programming can have positive impacts on youth outcomes. These social-emotional learning programs can not only impact their social-emotional well-being, but academics, behavior, attitudes, class participation, and other areas as well. Along with evidence-based social-emotional learning programs that claim to be evidence, so there are social-emotional programs already being used and they claim to be evidence-based, but lack sufficient empirical support to make that claim. So although a lot of school psychologists think they might be using evidence-based research, some of those are not actually evidence-based. The problem is that numerous organizations, some government and others private, have created their own definition of what constitutes as evidence-based. This leads to confusion among practitioners when adopting and selecting interventions supported by empirical evidence. Now, while selecting interventions for the consultation class that I took last year or last semester, my classmates and I got an idea of what that selection process is like, and it's not as easy as you would think. For example, on WorkWorks Clearinghouse, very little information was present for mental health Tier 2 interventions. WorkWorks Clearinghouse is a respected website that school psychologists use for evidence-based interventions. Now, since there wasn't anything for mental health Tier 2 interventions, does that mean that there's not any evidence-based interventions for this category? I don't think that's what it means. It could just be that it's not on that site. So other factors have to be considered, such as how often is the site updated, which was one of the things that we noticed. It could be even a year or more. How stringent are the guidelines for inclusion on this site? And supposedly, what Works Clearinghouse is very strict on the interventions that it allows to be put on there as evidence-based. Now, this would be different from another website that doesn't have the same stringent recommendations. So something else that you might think about is this particular site that you're looking for the evidence-based interventions, does it focus mainly on academics? Is that why there wasn't any for maybe social emotional learning or something like that? So previously, the No Child Left Behind mandated that evidence-based interventions be used. Now, we know that No Child Left Behind has been left behind, and now we have the current Every Student Succeeds Act. Now, it's going to leave that choice up to the states, but we can assume that the mandates for evidence-based interventions will remain, because why would they not want school psychologists to only use interventions that have been proven to be effective? With this said, McKevitt suggests that areas that should be addressed include training, school psychology programs, where they stress the use of evidence-based interventions, and we know that that's being done at TAC. Students who are trained to use them will more likely do so in practice. So if while they're in graduate school, they're trained on how to find evidence-based interventions and how to use them, then they'll likely do it as a practitioner. However, in a study that was done in 2003, by Chernoff, it determined that although students have the knowledge and they know the criteria of what constitutes as an evidence-based intervention, they rarely get the opportunity to apply this knowledge in practice. Now, to support the use in practice, Cratchwell and Chernoff recommend 5 different recommendations. The first one being developing a practice research network in school psychology. Number 2, ensuring that evidence-based interventions are examined in school-based contexts. So some of this research wasn't conducted in the context of school environment. So that's important as well. 3, establishing guidelines for practitioner use and evaluate evidence-based interventions in practice. Number 4, encouraging professional development opportunities for practitioners. Number 5, creating partnerships with other professional groups that examine evidence-based interventions. Now that I'm a member of NASP and have frequented the communication boards, I see that practitioners are currently struggling with finding evidence-based interventions on a daily basis. Practitioners routinely post problems that they're encountering in the schools with the hopes that their colleagues can give them an idea of how to move forward, how to proceed. So I asked myself, how much are school psychologists actually reviewing the literature themselves and searching for evidence-based interventions to formulate their recommendations? The McKevitt study for social emotional learning interventions found that in general, school psychologists are not well informed about evidence-based published social emotional learning interventions. And surprisingly, less than a third of respondents indicated They use journal articles or online databases for regular research on evidence-based measures. So less than a third said that they actually review the literature themselves when looking for social and emotional learning interventions. So what are they doing? They're consulting with colleagues. That was the most preferred method for gaining information about evidence-based interventions. So in response to the question, what makes educational and school psychologists leaders in evidence-based school intervention? For questions 1 to 3, the answer is their use of observation in various learning contexts, their selections of tools that are reliable and valid, their use of the ecological model when working in the schools. However, there is still room for improvement. As the research that I've done for the literature to find out what school psychologists are doing, they don't always rely on what the research says. We now see they rely a lot on recommendations from colleagues. By incorporating the previous 5 recommendations into school psychology and the practice of school psychology, we can make sure that school psychologists are using true evidence-based interventions in their practice. Thank you.